Welcome and thank you for being here with us. Today's presenter is Robert C. Plumb. He is the author of Your Brothers in Arms, A Union Soldier's Odyssey, and The Better Angels, 5 Women Who Changed Civil War America. And by the way, his book is available at our local Northshire bookstore. He has given book presentations throughout the Washington, D.C. area and participated in related programs in Connecticut, Maryland, Missouri, New York, Pennsylvania, and Virginia. Prior to writing his 2 books, Mr. Plumb was an executive at Fannie Mae and General Electric with assignments in the U.S. and internationally. He has served as a member of the Dean's Advisory Council, College of Arts and Sciences, State University of New York at Buffalo. He is a member of the American Battlefield Trust, the Montgomery County, Maryland Historical Society, the Montgomery County Civil War Roundtable, the Civil War Roundtable of the District of Columbia, and the Society of Civil War Historians. And he's joining us from Maryland today. We're very happy to have you here. Thank you, Bob.
Thank you very much, Gloria. One of the things that was a little overwhelming when I first started doing Zoom presentations was not knowing who was out there and not having the opportunity to answer questions in person. But it's turned out to be great. I mean, you have a presenter presenting from France, and you have a guy who's going to be presenting from a neighboring state here in Virginia. So it really has expanded and made a lot of things possible that weren't possible before. So I got over my shyness on Zoom, and I really appreciate it now. And also a couple of times I've given talks in the district, and people from various states have tuned in. And so they will call me later and say, oh gosh, can you give a talk to our group? So it's really been nice. I will say that I don't know if in the state of Vermont you have something called a cicada. It's the 7-year locust. Well, we have them here in droves. Fortunately, at this time of night, they're quieted down, but they have this enormous buzz. So if you hear a buzz in the background, I'm not operating near a sawmill. It's the cicada population, which seems this year they're worse than they've ever been before. But in any event, that shan't stop us. So, Liz, if we could put up the slides, I think we'll get started here. Great, there we go. People ask me usually in the course of this presentation, how did you happen to write a book about 5 women in the Civil War? Which is a great question. As Gloria said, my first book was based on letters from a Union soldier. A member of the family had bought these letters back years and years ago. And when I retired, I sat down and I looked at these letters and transcribed them and realized that there was a book there. Well, in the course of working on the book, of course, I went to many, many libraries, archives here in Washington and other locations, walked all the battlefields with this particular soldier who fought with a unit in the Pennsylvania, 115th Pennsylvania, went to these battlefields. I kept coming across the names of women. And I thought, the next book, I'm going to spend a little time doing some research on these women because it intrigues me. And the women I'm going to talk about today, the 5, are not conventional players in the Civil War, with one exception, and I'll talk about her in a little bit. They didn't carry guns into battle. They weren't leading armies, but they did some very, very amazing things during the time of the Civil War, prior to and during the Civil War, that we still know about today. And their contributions leave legacies that I'm going to talk a little bit about today also. So I made up my mind that my next book would be about these women that I thought really warranted a closer look. So I now narrowed the women down to 5, and we could talk a little bit maybe in the Q&A why those 5 and why not another 6 or 7. But it seemed to me, in terms of their contributions and also in terms of the legacy that they have left behind, these just came to the front very quickly. And they were accomplished women. And I thought, when I was thinking about how to put this all together, Lincoln's first inaugural address came to mind. So if I could have the next slide, please. His first inaugural address, Lincoln was, of course, prescient about many things, but He knew that the country was going to be split in two as a result of the oncoming war. This talk was given in March of 1861. The war started in April of 1861. And the mystic chords of memory stretching from every battlefield, patriot grave, and hearthstone will swell the chorus of the Union. But surely he thought that it will be touched by the better angels of our nature. So I thought that was an apt title from the book and the five women that I was going to be talking about. Now, it's no surprise. I think this past election year, every person who's running for office talked about the better angels. But so I can't claim credit for coming up with that term, but I think it's very apt. And certainly Lincoln, I would give full credit to Lincoln on what he was talking about, the need to bring the country back together. And we'll talk about that in some detail. What I'd like to do is just quickly now introduce you to the five so that you know who I'm going to be talking about and give you just a quick snapshot. And then we'll spend time on each of the five as we get deeper into the talk. The first, next slide, please. Maybe no surprise, Harriet Tubman, who I believe can be considered the liberator of the enslaved. First herself, and then 80 plus enslaved people that she brought back over 14 rescue missions that she conducted over a decade. And that decade was the antebellum period just prior to the Civil War. So we'll spend some time talking about her and some of the things she did. This is, as a clue, this is the only one of the five who carried a weapon. And we'll talk a little bit about what that involved. Next slide, please. The next woman I want to talk about is Harriet Beecher Stowe, and I consider her a literary provocateur. She wrote this very moving narrative about the lives of enslaved people. And she brought attention to people in the North and to the South, although it wasn't very well received in the South. It brought attention to the enslavement problem and what it was causing in the North. And it really created a major stir in the literary world and also in the personal world of what people started to think about enslavement. The third person we're going to talk about, the third woman, next slide, please, is Julia Ward Howe. Whoops, well, we got one ahead there. Next, that's it. Julia Ward Howe, who wrote this inspiring song that helped bring the Union out of a period of profound pessimism. When she wrote this, the Union was sort of at its absolute nadir at the beginning of the war. But her words in the Battle Hymn of the Republic helped rally the North around a noble cause with words like, quote, "As he died to make men holy, let us die to make men free." And the words to encourage hope. Again, a quote from the hymn, "The trumpet that never calls retreat." These were inspiring words, and they did amazing things. And we'll talk about exactly how that happened. I will point to you now, it's very important that you look at this slide down sort of 2/3 of the way down. You see how Julia Ward Howe is identified here. Not as Julia Ward Howe, but Mrs. Dr. Samuel Gridley Howe. And this was a problem that Julia Ward Howe had to face most of her married life, was getting out from underneath the dictatorial role that her husband played and what he thought she should be doing versus what she wanted to do. It did appear in the Atlantic Monthly, and it appeared a couple of months after she wrote it. And we'll go into more detail about how she came to write it and how that took place. The next slide, please. So our fourth woman, yes, she's the inspirer of the cause. Clara Barton. We have a little problem with the slides here, but you can just overlook some of the sort of scattered letters here. Clara Barton is a former teacher, grade school teacher, a U.S. Patent Office clerk, who overcame daunting discrimination as she struggled to overcome the shortcomings of the Army's medical corps by providing supplies when and where they were needed. Many times, Clara Barton put herself in harm's way. That is to say, she was on the battlefield, and I call her the leader in casualty relief. Certainly, she was a nurse, as we've been told, since childhood, but more importantly, she employed her genius to acquire and transport medical supplies to where they were needed the most on the battlefield. And we'll talk some more details about that. That was her true genius. And if you could say there was any genesis of her interest and her ability to start the American Red Cross, it was certainly in this area of casualty relief. And then the next person we're going to talk about, and the final person, is probably the least well-known, Sarah Josepha Hale. She was a person who saw the need for an American Day of Thanksgiving. She tried for many years prior to the war to convince presidents and governors and others that it would be important to recognize a day of Thanksgiving. But it wasn't until the Civil War that she really started to bear down on these people who could institute a day of Thanksgiving. She wrote a letter to Lincoln saying that I think it is very important that the country, despite the fact that we have a civil war going on, eventually look at reconciliation and the coming together of North and South. She thought that the 4th of July would be as important as Thanksgiving and vice versa. Thanksgiving would be important as the 4th of July, to be a national celebration. And I think in a kind of a comprehensive way, this slide shows a cartoon, as it was called back in the mid-1800s. A cartoon that probably best depicts what Sarah Josepha Hale was trying to accomplish. These aren't pilgrims sitting around the table. They are a mix of Americans, new immigrants, people that have been here. You see Native Americans, young people, older people, men, women. And then the interesting iconography around it is come one, come all, free and equal. Across the top, you see Abraham Lincoln, Lady Liberty, the statue, George Washington, freedom, depicted by the lady there, and General Grant, who was the president when this cartoon, as it was called, was done in Harper's Weekly in 1869. And then very interesting, at the far right, above Uncle Sam, who you can see here carving a turkey, is something called Castle Gardens. It's a painting of something called Castle Gardens. Castle Gardens was the precursor to Ellis Island. So this is where immigrants came to be processed in the early 1800s. The other interesting thing about this is that the artist, Thomas Nast, who you've probably seen other of his work, was an immigrant, a German immigrant himself. So a very interesting depiction of Thanksgiving is perhaps we haven't seen it in many times before. I think that Sarah Josepha Hale has been undercovered, if you will, by the population in the United States about what she did to create a Thanksgiving Day. I think the next slide, please. What we'll do now is spend a little bit of time on each one and what some of their key accomplishments were in the time that we have. Harriet Tubman here, this is one of the earliest photographs known of Harriet Tubman. She was probably in her mid-40s when this photo was taken. This just turned up several years ago by a collector, a photography collector, who gave it to the Library of Congress, who in turn shares it with the Museum in Washington. But it is the earliest photograph we have of Harriet Tubman. In 1849, Harriet Tubman, who had been born into slavery 27 years earlier, decided that she would take steps to free herself along with two of her brothers, Henry and Ben Ross. Her maiden name was Ross. She was known as Araminta Ross, and when she got married, she changed her name to Harriet Tubman, her husband's name. She was married to a man named John Tubman, who was a free black man. And he decided he would not accompany her on her trip north to freedom because in those days, the distinction between enslaved blacks and free blacks, particularly in the South, was pretty uncertain. So he thought that he would raise the stakes of being caught and treated as a slave and didn't want to accompany his wife to the north. that distinction was pretty clear in antebellum, that if you were a free black, you didn't generally venture very far out of your general area so that you could be confused with being an enslaved person who was fleeing. Soon after they decided to get underway, the two brothers, Henry and Ben, said the stakes were just too high. It was too high to try to escape to freedom in the North, and that they thought that the penalties of being caught were just too high. The two brothers and the sister, and as well as her husband, lived in Dorchester County, Maryland, which is on the eastern shore. It's near a town, Cambridge. So Harriet had to continue on alone without her two brothers. And she did that. She used only the North Star as her guiding source, and the local waterways, which are this, that area of Dorchester County is just filled with local waterways that are used for clamming and crab catching and so forth. And she knew those from the time she was a young girl. So she used those to kind of figure out exactly where she was. She had no GPS, obviously. I consider this was an act of incredible bravery and fortitude. It was remarkable in the way this woman planned and executed this flight to freedom over 3 states. She started in Maryland, as I said, went through the state of Delaware, and then finally into Pennsylvania. That was above the Mason-Dixon, so it was a free state. But I think even more remarkably, she made 14 more trips back to Dorchester County and guided up to 80 enslaved people to freedom in the North over 11 years. Every subsequent trip she took back was more and more challenging. This was what we have come to call the Underground Railroad. And each return trip, of course, when you go using the Underground Railroad, these safe houses that were safe on one trip may not be safe on the second or third trip. So she had to constantly vary her path to the North. She was helped by both enslaved and free blacks, and by whites, particularly Quakers, took a great interest in helping the enslaved people in the state of Maryland to escape to the North. The other thing that was a factor during this period of time when she was freeing people was the U.S. Congress passed the Fugitive Slave Act, which made it against the law, carried penalty, it was considered a crime to help an enslaved person flee to the North. So this put a lot of pressure on Harriet Tubman, both from the standpoint of, finding it very hard to find people to help her because they were subject to arrest and confinement. And also the stakes got higher because those who owned enslaved people paid higher and higher rewards for their return. So she had a lot of things working against her during those 11 years when she was trying to free enslaved people. She was so successful that one ardent abolitionist, which I'm sure you've heard of, John Brown, came to see her in Canada. As the Fugitive Slave Act began to take hold, she decided it was best for her to not stop in New York State, even though slavery was abolished in New York State in 1827. She could be extradited from the state of New York to go back to Maryland and be tried. So she decided she would move to Canada. She moved to a town called St. Catharines, Canada, which is just over the border from New York State. Well, John Brown visited her there in early 1858, and his proposal was that she accompany him on his raid to Harper's Ferry, Virginia, then Virginia, now that's West Virginia. And he made a very appealing case to her. He needed her help. He wanted her to help guide the troops that he was going to take in. But something just didn't sound right to Harriet Tubman. So she told him she would consider it, but she needed some time to think about it. And she did. She approached her friend, Frederick Douglass, to see what his take was, because she knew he had worked with John Brown in past years. Frederick Douglass said to her, Harriet, do not go on this. This is, in his words, doomed to failure. She also was caring for her aged mother and father that she had freed from Dorchester County, Maryland. And she was concerned that if she left them, for she didn't know how long this John Brown raid was going to last, it would have jeopardized their health, perhaps. So she decided not to go. She turned John Brown down. And it was probably a good thing based on what happened to John Brown at the Harper's Ferry raid in 1858. Next slide, please. I showed a slide in the beginning that showed Harriet Tubman with a gun, holding a gun. Well, during the Civil War, she played an important role in a raid on Confederate stores in South Carolina. She helped guide Union troops and played a key role in bringing hundreds of enslaved people out of an area in central South Carolina. There's a river called the Combahee River that runs from the coast up into the central part of South Carolina. She and these Union troops, along with 3 boats that they brought along, went up the river, were successful in burning Confederate stores, taking some stores back with them on the boats, and freeing about 700 enslaved people. The amazing thing is that this foray into South Carolina, the heart of the Confederacy, not a single person was lost. There wasn't a single casualty. And as I said from the beginning, I said that she was the only person of the 5 who carried a weapon, but there's no report that she ever fired the weapon on the raid, since it was a stealthy raid that happened quickly and completely surprised the Confederates. Her legacy, Harriet Tubman's legacy, has been her track record of successfully liberating enslaved people under the most difficult of circumstances. With meager resources. This woman had very little money. She accomplished so much with so little. She was among, I think, the bravest of the brave and selflessly devoted to freeing people. During the antebellum period, she laid rest to the claim in some quarters. We have trouble believing this today in 2021, that enslaved people chose slavery because it guaranteed them a food, shelter, and an opportunity to work at something. She once said, and this is a quote, "Now I've been free and I know what a dreadful condition slavery is. I have seen hundreds of escaped slaves, but I never saw one who was willing to go back and be a slave," end of quote. After the Civil War, Harriet Tubman involved herself in many causes, not the least of which was helping indigent African Americans, and also took a very firm stance on suffrage, giving talks on suffrage for at least the eastern part of the United States. She was helped considerably with her financial plight by William Seward, who, if you recall, was Lincoln's Secretary of State. He lived in Auburn, New York, and that's where eventually Harriet Tubman settled in Auburn. He helped her fund a home there and also fund a home for aged and indigent African Americans. She died there in Auburn in 1913 at age 91, so quite a long life, despite the hazards that she faced as a younger person. The next slide, please. Next person we're going to talk about is Harriet Beecher Stowe. She was a true blue Connecticut Yankee. She was born in the heart of New England in Litchfield, Connecticut. And young Harriet Beecher flourished in school, excelling in mathematics and Latin and science at the Litchfield Female Academy. And you might say, well, what's so unusual about that? Well, those 3 subjects, Latin, science, and mathematics, were typically only taught to young men. So she, in many ways, was a breakthrough person and did very well in school. She was also known as an excellent writer. She wrote excellent compositions and went on to Hartford Free Academy. She was the editor of the newspaper. And she was the daughter of a minister. She was the sister of a minister, and she eventually married a minister, Calvin Ellis Stowe, and took his name, Harriet Beecher Stowe. He was a theology professor at Lane Theological Seminary, where her father was the president. Lane Theological Seminary was in Cincinnati, Ohio, and the family moved to Ohio when Harriet was about in her mid-teens, after she had finished Hartford Academy. And after her marriage, she began writing and was published in 3 monthly magazines on a regular basis. 2 influences led her to write what would become her magnum opus, which of course is Uncle Tom's Cabin. She lived in Cincinnati, as I said, with her husband, and they became very active in the Underground Railroad in Cincinnati. Cincinnati, of course, if you're familiar with the geography, is right across the river from Kentucky, where slavery was practiced. So she and her husband were active participants in getting enslaved people free. And when the Fugitive Slave Act was enacted by U.S. Congress, she was absolutely furious that they were subject to arrest and confinement for helping people seek freedom. So that really sort of gave her the impetus to write what became her most famous book and her most famous writing. Next slide, please. Oh, I think we have to go one more. Here we go. She began writing a story to be published as a monthly serial in National Era magazine. I think we've just lost her head here. She drew on sources to write this article, such as Theodore Wells' American Slavery as It Is, and Josiah Henson's The Life of Josiah Henson, formerly a slave, and drew heavily on her own experiences and that of her husband from their experiences running the Underground Railroad in Cincinnati. And from June 1851 through April 1852, Uncle Tom's Cabin appeared weekly to a growing number of eager readers. And that was a popular way of presenting fictional accounts. You may recall that Charles Dickens, a number of his books were started out as serials in magazines. Her work was so popular over the course of the year of it appearing in National Era that in March of 1852, she was approached by John P. Jewett Publishing to publish Uncle Tom's Cabin as a book. And the first week that it came off the presses, it sold 10,000 copies, which is pretty darn good. A year after its release, the book had sold 300,000 copies, which is, even today, is a monumental bestseller. In the mid-1800s, this was considered truly extraordinary. As you might imagine, praise and criticism for Uncle Tom's Cabin came immediately. To address the negative criticism, rather than try to tackle each criticism that came in, she sat down and wrote a reasoned, fact-based response, which she called A Key to Uncle Tom's Cabin. She took those things which were fictional accounts in the book, and then against those put all the different things that she had used as source to prove the veracity of what she had written, that it was in fact true. There were thoughts that, she had invented all this. It was a figment of her imagination, total fiction. Well, the key proved to people that it could be substantiated with facts, and she was very smart in doing that. In the court of public opinion, at least, her work was seen as being a valuable insight into the slavery problem. And it's reported that when Stowe visited the White House in 1862, Abraham Lincoln said to her, quote, "So you're the little woman who wrote the book that made this great war." Whether or not that's absolutely correct has some historians wringing their hands, but I think for the most part, that's how Lincoln felt about it when he met her. Her legacy as the first successful author of a novel of what I would call social justice, and others that you can think of in the 20th century came along, such as Upton Sinclair's The Jungle, about the horrors of the meatpacking industry in the Midwest. And certainly John Steinbeck's Grapes of Wrath about migrant workers were really sort of started and incubated by Uncle Tom's Cabin and its success in taking a fictional account, a very powerful fictional account, and uncovering some problems. I think one of the things I like in these talks to mention is that her book has provoked some modern day disapproval. The term Uncle Tom carries with it offending overtones for some people. But the image of a subservient Uncle Tom came from not the book, but something called the Tom shows that were very popular after the close of the Civil War. These were nothing more than minstrel shows, usually white men in blackface singing minstrel songs. They borrowed the characters from Uncle Tom's Cabin, but never did they ever get approval from Harriet Beecher Stowe to use those characters in a stage play. So those characteristics that we think of as servile and ingratiating did not come from Uncle Tom's Cabin. There's a literature professor at Harvard University by the name of Amanda Claybaugh. She has written extensively about Uncle Tom's Cabin. This is a quote from her. "The servile old Uncle Tom exists nowhere in the novel. He is the creation of the Tom shows." And she continues, "It was the Tom shows that transferred this heroic character into a weak and feeble-minded old man, shuffling and grinning at even those who oppress him. Such a Tom exists nowhere in the novel." Her legacy, I mentioned about the social justice novel, lives on even today in certain works of fiction. So she was indeed had an incredible legacy that she's left behind, in addition to writing something that got the North at least understanding more about what slavery involved. The next slide, please. Next, we're going to talk about Julia Ward Howe, this woman. She grew up leading a very privileged, isolated life in a very large house at the top of Manhattan in New York. Her mother died in 1824, leaving this 5-year-old, Julia, as the focus of her father's smothering attention. He was a strict Calvinist, and her father, Samuel, shielded this young daughter of his from any influences outside the house, which he felt would corrupt her. So her education, her friends, her family, and life experiences were very tightly controlled by her father. When she was 22 years old, she met a very dashing young physician who seemed a perfect fit for her fairy tale existence. Samuel Gridley Howe, MD, was even a knight. He was a Chevalier of the Order of Saint Savior, a title bestowed on him by the Greek government for his service during Greek's War of Independence from the Turks. However, what Julia Ward Howe quickly realized that she had gone from one gilded cage overseen by Samuel Ward, her father, to another gilded cage controlled by Samuel Gridley Howe. It was clear that Dr. Howe wanted a woman who would bear his children and be devoted to child rearing exclusively and domestic duties. He did not want an aspiring poet that his wife longed to be, but Julia Ward Howe persevered. In 1848, some of her poems were published in a volume called Female Poets in America. And much to her husband's dismay, she submitted a group of poems that in 1853 were published as a volume called Passion Flowers. And despite receiving glowing praise from literary notables such as Henry Wadsworth Longfellow, Dr. Howe was furious. Even the favorable reviews from the literary establishment and the popular reception by the public for these poems did not change her husband's position. The fact that the same publishing house that published Julia Ward Howe's poems turned down Dr. Howe's manuscript, saying it really wasn't of a broad enough appeal and wasn't something they wanted to publish. You can imagine that created some major problems in the Howe household. Next slide, please. Whoops, back one. There we go. The couple was undergoing a very tense, strained relationship when Julia Ward Howe accompanied her husband to Washington, D.C., so he could attend to his duties in the Sanitary Commission, an organization that was helped to improve medical conditions for Union troops in their camps. They stayed at Willard's Hotel during their trip to Washington City in November of 1861. And while Dr. Howe was meeting with Sanitary Commission folks, Julia and her pastor, James Freeman Clark, and some friends who had accompanied the Howes to Washington from Massachusetts, decided to visit Union troops in Northern Virginia, just across the Potomac from Washington, D.C. There, the group saw the troops in encampment and saw them marching. And Julia Ward Howe was struck by how young these soldiers were, some not much older than her own children. And also she was struck by the exuberance as they marched along singing, "John Brown's body lies a-mouldering in the grave." As the Howe entourage made its way back to Washington after a day with the troops, Reverend Clark suggested to Julia, maybe she, as a published poet and an accomplished poet, could write a better version of this marching song rather than, John Brown moldering in his grave. Well, that night, Julia Ward Howe awoke and moved to write a poem about her impression of seeing the troops on the march during the day. She wrote quickly, put verses down on Sanitary Commission paper that had been lying around. And when she awoke in the morning, she made some minor changes to her poem, but was satisfied that the work was inspired and it conveyed her feelings, she thought. And after her return home from Washington, she sent a copy to the editors of the Atlantic Monthly. And editor James Field quickly said, yes, we want to publish that. And in fact, they did in February of 1852. It appeared on the front page of Atlantic Monthly, the Battle Hymn of the Republic, the hymn sung to the tune of John Brown's body. The moving lyrics and the marching tempo were favored by the troops. It quickly spread, very quickly. For both the troops and the civilian public in the North, the battle hymn captured the feeling of a noble cause that had been absent at the beginning of the war. As he died to make men holy, let us die to make men free, was the poetic expression of the Emancipation Proclamation. And the lyrics, the trumpet that never calls retreat, carried with them a new resolve for victory that had been missing in the North. It was, in fact, Dr. Samuel Gridley Howe who put it best, I believe. He said, the Union troops do not lack for food, clothing, or money, but they do lack noble watchwords and inspiring ideas as ones worth fighting for. End of quote. Certainly Julia's Battle Hymn of the Republic provided those words and ideas worth fighting for. Julia Ward Howe took up many other causes after the American Civil War was over. She took up pacifism, women's rights, women's suffrage, abolition of the death penalty. But always when she gave these talks on various subjects after the Civil War, the battle hymn legacy continued. Years after the war, when Howe addressed audiences on a variety of these issues that I mentioned, there was always a request at the conclusion of her talk to sing the battle hymn. One reporter who covered her talk in Boston wrote, quote, "When the grand old woman of America sang the anthem, there was not a dry eye in the house." Julia Ward Howe died in 1910 at age 91. Next slide, please. Clara Barton began her professional career. Here she is as a young woman. At age 18 as a teacher in her home state of Massachusetts. Soon after gaining some experience and wanting a change in location for reasons we're not quite clear of today, she moved to Bordentown, New Jersey, to work at a school that was facing challenges with its male students. The boys in the school were falling behind in their studies and not motivated by their teachers, and no one seemed to be able to solve the problem. Well, Clara Barton succeeded in turning the situation around rather quickly, so that both male and achieved success. There's a story that she told after the Civil War in some of her talks that she gave around the country. She told how she was treating a Union soldier who was wounded on the battlefield, and he said to her, quote, "Do you remember me, Miss Barton? I was in your class in New Jersey." The story is that she did, in fact, remember him. Her efforts in Bordentown began to pay off. She was achieving great success, and the school flourished under her leadership. And then the school board decided the growing school needed a male principal to run things. They brought in a man at a higher salary than Barton made and put him in charge. Not surprisingly, Clara Barton said, "No, I'm not going to stay here," and she left. She was discouraged, but she decided she would try something completely different. She would try the patent office, work in the patent office in Washington, D.C. Just a footnote to history, the male principal was sacked after 4 months on the job because of his incompetence. What Clara Barton found at the patent office was also a male-dominated organization, but she persevered. But then as the war broke out, she realized she would like to begin to channel her efforts to help Union troops from her home state in Massachusetts. Quickly, she built a network of key political contacts in Washington, including Senator Henry Wilson, who was the senator from Massachusetts. She used her local contacts in New England to donate and collect supplies, and then she leveraged her political contacts in Washington to gain access to the Army Quartermaster Corps, which became her delivery mechanism for getting medical supplies to the field. The story is she went into Colonel Rucker, who was the head of quartermaster in Washington, and pleaded with him to provide a wagon that she wanted to take some supplies to the field. And he was rather brusque, told her no. And she said, "Would you come outside and look at the 3 warehouses I have filled with medical supplies that need to be taken to the field?" Well, that even recalcitrant Rucker realized that he was up against a woman who was not going to let go until he gave her a wagon, in which he did. And he became a good friend and a fast cohort in getting her wagons to take supplies to the field. Next slide, please. Following the battles of Bull Run and Cedar Mountain, Barton was able to get much needed supplies to Fairfax Station, Virginia, where the wounded from those battles were being taken. But that wasn't good enough for Clara Barton. She wanted to be closer to the battlefield. So she brought supplies to the battlefield at Antietam in September of 1862. "My place," she once said, "is right behind the cannon," meaning I need to be where the casualties are occurring so they can be treated quickly. Later in the war, she brought supplies to Fredericksburg, Virginia, at the battle there, and at Fort Wagner in South Carolina. Once again, she was present on the battlefield. We've been told for many years that Clara Barton was a nurse, and yes, she did perform nursing duties, but her primary expertise was getting medical supplies where they were needed during a time when the Army Medical Corps was not able to keep up with the demands or the extent of the casualties they were seeing. Barton was an expert in logistics, and this essential skill led to her interest and qualifications in the area of disaster relief, and really paved the way for her to start the American Red Cross. Following the war, she also set up a missing soldiers office to account for the thousands of Union soldiers who were lost and presumably killed on the battlefield or died in prison camps. A lot of Union soldiers died in prison camps. As with her work during the war, Barton kept meticulous logs and accounts of the missing, often drawing on information that was provided by the soldiers' families. She did all this on a shoestring budget, and at the conclusion of this work, Barton had located and marked 13,000 graves of missing soldiers. She was very adept at working through the political processes from her experience in the Civil War, and she used this expertise to lobby the U.S. Senate to ratify the Treaty of Geneva in 1882. The Treaty of Geneva passage was necessary in order for her to start and establish a Red Cross organization in the United States. And the Senate did pass it, and it was signed by the president. And she had a clear way then to start the Red Cross process. Clara Barton lived to age 90, and she died in April of 1912 in Glen Echo, Maryland, which is outside of Washington, D.C. Next slide, please. The final woman I'm going to talk about is this woman, Sarah Josepha Hale. She closes out the better angels of the Civil War timeline. Her important contribution was the initiation of a national day of Thanksgiving that superseded regional differences and began the process of national reconciliation. For years, Sarah Josepha Hale had lobbied and written to state leadership and made appeals to 4 sitting U.S. presidents to proclaim a national day of Thanksgiving. None of the presidents responded to her suggestion. Then, after writing to Abraham Lincoln on September 28th of 1863, the president proclaimed the last Thursday in November as a day of Thanksgiving, within a week of receiving Sarah Josepha Hale's letter. Hale in the mid-19th century was a prominent editor, first of the Ladies magazine and later Godey's Ladies book. And she used her publications platforms to promote women's higher education, raising money to help fund Vassar College, and raise funds for the Mount Vernon Ladies Association that was putting money together to restore a badly deteriorating Mount Vernon. She also played an active role in establishing the Ladies Medical Missionary Society and promoting the Female Medical College of Philadelphia. Next slide, please. She accomplished these worthy projects while running one of the nation's most popular national magazines. She rose from being a widowed mother of 5 children in her mid-30s, never remarried, to editing a highly regarded magazine where she worked with notable authors such as Harriet Beecher Stowe, Edgar Allan Poe, William Cullen Bryant, and Frances E. Hodgson. If that name doesn't ring a bell, that's the author of The Secret Garden, Little Lord Fauntleroy, and The Little Princess. She continued to work as an editor, that is Hale, until 1877, and she stepped down as the editor of the ladies' book at age 89. She died 2 years later at age 91. While she had over 50 years' experience editing 2 major national magazines, she always considered her greatest achievement was helping create a national day of Thanksgiving backed by a presidential proclamation. Well, Daniel Webster said in discussing the founders of the United States, we would benefit from contemplating their example and studying their character. I think the same is true of the 5 women I call the better angels. Next slide, please. So what I want to do is just quickly go through some of the things that I think these women had in common. Let's just kind of click through. They were persistent. Once they started something, they didn't stop. They kept on going, as I've said with Clara Barton. They had courage, whether that was the courage on the battlefield, as Clara Barton had, or Harriet Tubman had, or courage to be a widow and trying to raise 5 children without any other means of support. They were self-assured. When they started things, they thought through what they wanted to do, and they went in with great self-assurance. They were persuasive. In the case of Harriet Tubman, she could not write. She was not literate, but she was very persuasive in talking. And the other 4 were brilliant writers who were very effective in being persuasive in the written word. They were assertive. They didn't stand back waiting to be told what to do. They moved ahead with great zeal. They were all compassionate, whether that was compassion for the enslaved people or compassion for treating soldiers on the battlefield. They had self-discipline. They all guided themselves. Even Sarah Josepha Hale, who worked for for a publisher, really ran the show. They all had to come up with their own schedules and meet their own deadlines. And then sovereignty. We often think of sovereignty as being something that states have, but I would say it's sure that all of the 5 women demonstrated that they were independent and largely free from external control. and that is being sovereign. The one woman who fought the hardest for that was Julie Ward Howe. Her husband challenged her independence, but eventually she prevailed. But the others all had this self sense of sovereignty and that they needed to succeed. Next slide, please. I'll close with the words of Clara Barton, who it seems to me summed up the impact of the Civil War on these women, these five, and also other women that were in the war. Quote, "Only an opportunity was waiting for women to prove to man that she could be in earnest, that she had character and firmness of purpose, that she was good for something in an emergency. The war offered her this opportunity." End of quote. Thank you very much. My only commercial here is what you see. The Better Angels is available as hardcover, Kindle, and in audio format, read by the actress Kate Mulligan, who does a marvelous job on it. So the next slide, please. I'd be glad to entertain any questions that you have. Well, the one thing, while people are thinking about their questions, one of the things that we ran into, my literary agent and I, he would come back and he'd say, "I've talked to a couple of publishers," and they said, everything's been written about Clara Barton and this, not Sarah Josepha Hale, but Clara Barton and Harriet Tubman. I said, there's a lot that hasn't been written, or it hasn't been written in the context of the Civil War. So I sent him back to talk to the publishers, and he came back and said, "Yeah, they got it now. They got it. They see what you're trying to accomplish."
Yeah, it's also interesting to me. They all lived in long lives, all of them.
All of them did, yes. The one, Harriet Beecher Stowe, did not live as long as the rest of them did, but they all, with the exception of her, all lived to be in their 90s.
Yeah, it's amazing.
Somebody asked me in one of the presentations, "Well, how did they do that?"
Yeah,
they ate well. I had a doctor on one of the calls, and he said, "Well, they didn't smoke or drink." I said, "Okay, tell me, doc."
I suppose that's probably true.
It's probably true, yeah.
Well, I'll ask a question, which is that you had said, why didn't you research 10 women or, 7 or 15, or, you just whittled it down to the 5?
Yeah, people have asked me, wasn't there any also-rans? There really weren't. I mean, I was looking for two things. I wanted what they did to be an accomplishment, and I wanted what they did to have some legacy. And even Sarah Josepha Hale, maybe people don't know her name today, but gosh, Thanksgiving. And it was because she was so persistent and finally struck a responsive chord with Lincoln that we have a Thanksgiving Day today. So nobody else quite made that list. There are some women that have been raised to me called the Grimke sisters. And they said, well, they lived in the South and they were abolitionists. I said, yes, but they moved to Philadelphia in their teens. So I can't really consider them, sort of rebels with a cause in the South on abolition, because they moved out of the South. And there have been other other women who have written great diaries. Mary Chestnut is one, a Southern woman. But to me, it wasn't an accomplishment that came up to the level of the 5 that I chose.
Okay.
And I don't mean to exclude anybody, but these were 5 that really.
We do have a question from Nancy. Did any have children that followed in their footsteps?
No, not to the extent. Let me kind of tick through them. Harriet Tubman never gave birth. She married the second husband much, much later in life. He was a Union veteran, an African-American Union veteran. No children. Harriet Beecher Stowe. Harriet Beecher Stowe had 6 children, but they were good kids, as we'd say. But none of them rose to the level of their mother and their writing ability. Julie Ward Howe, unfortunately, had some children that kind of went astray, but nobody achieved anything there. Clara Barton had no children. And as I said, Sarah Josepha Hale had 5 children, and she sent them all including the women, to college. But unfortunately, her daughter, Sarah Josepha Hale, I guess would you call her junior, she died at a very early age, kind of a tragic thing. But she was a teacher and she had started a school, so she might have been prepped to do something. But no one seemed to want to get into the business that their mother was in, which was publishing, and editing a major national magazine.
Yeah, interesting. What are you working on now? What can we look forward to?
Well, I belong, as you said, as Gloria said, I belong to the Montgomery County Historical Society. And in a meeting not a couple of years ago, they were looking for topics. And I said, well, I'll write about Richard Montgomery, whose name is Montgomery County. And someone who heads it up contacted me about 6 months ago and said, okay, we're going to make you do that. So I've been doing that, and it's been time consuming. But my next thing is probably, I've been writing a blog on Civil War topics. I may turn the blogs into something, or I may look at a work of fiction. I have something vaguely in mind on a work of fiction, not to do with the Civil War.
Oh.
This would be branching out into something completely different.
Okay.
One of the things, if people are thinking of more questions, one of the things I sometimes mention is that these women were not cookie cutter women. And by that, I mean, they had their own personalities, they had their own quirks. For example, Sarah Josepha Hale was the only one of the 5 women born in the 18th century. She was born in the late 1700s. For all she did for women's education, raised money, sent her daughters to college, she did not believe in suffrage for women. In fact, a good friend of hers gave a speech, and she was president, and she walked out and think women should have the right to vote. So, as I said, they were not all of a single mind about suffrage and its value. The other 4 were very strong suffrage advocates. But not Sarah Josepha Hale. People ask me why, and I think, well, she was born in the late 1700s. I think she came from a different era. That's all I can do to explain it. Well, not only did she raise money for women's colleges, she also encouraged women to go into fields like the medical field and the publishing field that had been basically women free for a long time. So why she was against suffrage, I don't know. Can't answer that one.
Interesting.
I just have a comment to make. Can you hear me?
Yes, Jean.
I live in Rupert, Vermont, and our house is a very old house. I have forgotten exactly when it was built, but it was part of the Underground Railroad. Mm-hmm. And if anybody would like to come and take a look, I can show you where the trapdoor was. And we're right across from the old railroad, just a perfect spot. I've not been able to find out from the people who have lived in this house anything about their adventures with the people on the Underground Railroad, but I would love to know more.
Sure, particularly during the time of the Fugitive Slave Act, that was there was Underground Railroad locations strategically set up to get African Americans, formerly enslaved people, to across the border, so that they couldn't be extradited back. So I would think Vermont would be key. I grew up in upstate New York, in Syracuse, New York, and when I was a little kid, somebody pointed a house to me. They said, that was an Underground Railroad. I said, I was maybe 12 at the time. I said, where are the tracks? I said, no. That was used for escape enslaved people. I said, I got a lot to learn. But yes, that central New York and Vermont, parts of Connecticut were very vital on the Underground Railroad.
Thank you. Enjoyed this very much.
Good.
Well, thank you so much, Bob. Really appreciate your being here this evening, and thank you all for coming.